Now, how valid is the law of comparative advantage? Now, you may remember we talked about two countries in the world, two products in the world, and two workers in each country. That was just to prove that international trade is better than not international trade. However, now let's get back to the law of comparative advantage. Now, if you're asked the question, outline the assumption underlying the law of comparative advantage, or outline the limitations of the law of comparative advantage, two different questions, same answer. 1. Transport costs do not exist. The law of comparative advantage, do not write loca. The law of comparative advantage assumes that transport costs do not exist. However, for an island nation like Ireland, transport costs can be a major cost factor and can act as a major barrier to trade. A firm's cost efficiency may be eliminated by transport costs involved. Now remember like the likes of Donegal catch, which has to go all the way from Donegal in frozen containers onto mainland Europe. Certainly there are transport costs there. The law of diminishing marginal returns does not apply. The law of comparative advantage assumes that the law of diminishing marginal returns does not apply, but it does apply. Hence, in the example that we've just used, each extra person employed will not continue to produce the same amount as the original person. A point will eventually be reached when an extra person employed will produce less additional output. Absolutely. Because, say for example, a person that's efficient at producing beer would not necessarily be as efficient as the person producing bread if they have to produce that bread. 3. Free trade takes place. The law of comparative advantage assumes that free trade actually takes place. Whilst this may be true within the EU, free trade is often limited where countries impose barriers to trade for economic, social, cultural, or moral reasons. The complete mobility of labour. In the example used, we've assumed that the person who becomes unemployed in each country as a result of specialisation occurring can switch to alternative jobs, right? And that there are no barriers to mobility. This is not always the case, as there are barriers to the complete mobility of labour. Now, I would learn 4, and that's enough. And then finally on this particular part of the chapter, why do governments intervene in international trade? So we're going to say, why do they intervene? And then we're going to look at how do they intervene. 1. They intervene to protect indigenous firms or infant industries. So, infant industries may have a difficulty competing with established industries in other countries. By protecting a newly established company, it may mature into a strong company worldwide. Protect domestic employment, protect Irish jobs. Foreign competition may result in job losses. By limiting imports, jobs may be protected. To prevent dumping. Now, dumping means, I suppose, flooding the market, flooding the foreign market with your product at a very cheap price. Barriers will stop other firms from dumping and so stop their ability to undermine domestic firms, which may result in their closure. To prevent imports from cheap labour economies. Companies cannot compete with those countries who gain their comparative advantage by paying their workers low wages. Competition from these countries may be considered unfair. So, you must know those 4. Why do the government intervene in international trade? And now we're going to see, how do they intervene in international trade? Right? And this can often be known as protectionism, a tariff. These are taxes on imports and are usually a percentage of the value price of the good. Tariffs raise revenue for government, they raise the price of foreign goods and discourage imports. Now, particularly if you're buying goods from outside of the EU. A quota. This is a restriction on the quantity of a particular good which can be imported. This restriction guarantees domestic producers a percentage of the market. So we're only allowing a certain amount of product in. Exchange control. Now, this really is something that the Irish government doesn't have an awful lot of control over, because we're part of the Eurozone and there are 19 countries that use the euro. And this is where imports from a particular country are limited to a certain money value. It safeguards our own currency. not that important anymore. An embargo, this is a complete ban on the importation of certain goods for political, health, and safety reasons. Administrative barriers. This is red tape which the government places in the path of importers to reduce imports. Examples will include excessive documentation, lengthy delays at ports, and exacting quality standards. And finally, subsidies. A subsidy is a payment made to producers to reduce the cost of production and increase exports. For example, wage subsidies to exporting firms, grants to exporting firms, and low interest loans to exporters. But basically, a subsidy is a price support. Now, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 all limit imports. Number 6 encourages exports.